welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's Miami Grand Prix and all the big talking points to have come out of it. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, should I say, by only 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam. Absolutely, yes. For those listening, he's doing the peace out sign. Coop, there is no lead editor, Ian Parks, but there is a very, very good reason for that. Ian is currently traveling to a special guest who me and Ian are recording with later on for a special episode of the Racing News 365 podcast next week. So be sure to check that out next week. But for now, Sam, just me and you, let's get straight into it because we have so much to discuss from Miami, starting off with one of the biggest talking points, a really serious topic, one which has been discussed by fans on social media non-stop, by all 20 drivers in Miami. Do we now need a Lego F1 race before every Grand Prix going forwards?
Oh, Nick.
The answer is yes.
Absolutely. There is no way that you can not do this every single round. It was the most entertaining 10, 15 minutes or so in F1 history, as far as I'm concerned. I absolutely loved it. It was brilliant. You know who else loved it?
Who?
The drivers. All 20 drivers. 10 life-size, usable Lego F1 cars. Mate, it was top-tier entertainment. It was so funny. And it released their inner children. And the videos that have kind of from the driver's perspective that have come out, I mean, Lewis Hamilton had one that went viral, and his laugh that is just infectious. Pierre Gasly's laugh, he's like an evil villain, it's all very kind of, cartoonish. It was so funny. It was top tier entertainment. And yeah, I don't think I've seen anyone have a negative word to say about it, including my cat, who's just walked across the screen.
For those who are watching, Ian has now been permanently replaced by Sam's cat. For those who are listening, I highly recommend going on to YouTube.
I'm so sorry.
It. We are having such a I wish I could tell you how disruptive a day we are having at Racing News 365. It has been a bit of a nightmare, but this seems to be Miami every single year. But anyways, in terms of Lego F1 cars, for me, I was in Monaco at the time, obviously, for the Formula E's Monaco E-Prix. For those, obviously, who watched the F1 updates will know that. And I was on the train back to Nice where I was staying, because it's a 20-minute train ride, very easy. And I was scrolling through social media and I saw, these F1 drivers in massive Lego F1 cars. And I was thinking, is this AI? Are these paintings? Or what is going on? This can't be real. Yes, I got to my apartment in Nice, opened my laptop, entered the Slack chat, and everybody in the team was cracking themselves up laughing because quite literally we had a Lego F1 race, something which I really do hope we see again because it was ingenious. And I think as well it's going to attract such a young audience. I'm speaking like toddlers who love Lego and now going to love Formula One as well. We're going to have a new audience, and Drive to Survive is going to have a huge child boom, I think, going forward. Sam, let's get on though with the fun question for today's episode, because of course the race was won by Oscar Piastri, who has now won 4 of the 6 Grand Prix races this season. Following Oscar's win on Sunday in Miami, how many races in F1 history have been won by an Australian driver?
Okay, so Oscar's got 6, Daniel Ricciardo's got 8, Alan Jones has 12, so we're at 26. I'm pretty sure there's some people from back in the day that I can't think of. Mark Webber, he's not that far back in the day. You know what? I'm going to go with 47.
Oh, you know what? By your standards, which are normally miles away from the correct answer, let's be honest. We know whenever we do these, Ian is always somehow almost, if not exactly bang on. You go normally for an adventurous answer. You go for the gamble, the risky approach, which at least in our predictors leaderboard has not worked for you so far. You are very, very close though. It's 49. So actually, Oscar's next win is going to be a really important one because that will then take it to 50 wins by Australian drivers in F1. There's a nice little stat, but let's now get into some juicy topics. What was, Sam, your biggest takeaway from the Miami Grand Prix?
My biggest takeaway from the Miami Grand Prix, I mean, there's lots. I think the big one is that Kimi Antonelli is just an absolute superstar in the making. Yes, obviously things could have gone better in the race. Both races, to be fair, he showed a little bit of inexperience or naivety in that first corner clash with Oscar Piastri, and somehow, even though he shaded George all weekend, George got the better result in the Grand Prix because Kimi just kind of fell backwards. But over one lap, he definitely had the measure of George. It was almost Ayrton Senna-esque, which kind of begs the question: is he the second coming of Ayrton Senna? Where's number 12? He was his hero growing up. And I'm not just saying that because he's a young driver with a lot of flair. If you look at how he wove together that sprint quali lap, it was just so on the limit. And it was absolutely fantastic. So my biggest takeaway is that, we're closer to Kimi being a superstar than I think we maybe thought we were. Because I think lots of people were starting to go, okay, this kid's got it. He has all the ingredients he needs. But I think we are going to see him flourish earlier than potentially predicted.
I agree with you. For those who are watching on YouTube and just saw me looking down, I was actually just texting Ian for his predictions for Imola because I realised I haven't actually asked him for that yet, because as we have a special guest for next week, we're doing our Imola predictions at the end of this episode, and we'll look back at our Miami predictions, which are very, very interesting in a moment. I agree with you though. My biggest takeaway was also actually Antonelli, but more the point of, you look at his F1 debut and obviously the crash at Monza in FP1 last year within, I think it was like 10 minutes into the session, and he simply was just pushing too hard too soon. It's so clear already that he is learning so quickly on the job. It almost looks, he looks comfortable, he looks in control, and actually he doesn't look like he's going to make a mistake. He just seems to be adjusting to the sport, the media, just everything going on around him so well, but more importantly, so quickly, which when you look at his age, he's 18 years old? He has got so many years ahead of him. If he's going to be adjusting to it at the rate he is now as a teenager still, which makes me feel very old despite only being 25, he is going to have such a career ahead of him, because Mercedes, yes, Max Verstappen's name keeps being linked to Mercedes. Will it ever happen? Probably not. But if it were, Kimi Antonelli would not be the driver making way for Max, because Mercedes Toto knows they have got a real star of the future in Kimi, who quite clearly is maybe not even a star of the future. He's a star now, because as you said, his sprint quali lap to claim sprint pole was brilliant. And I think it will be interesting what he does in Imola, which I guess in a way is obviously his first home race competing as a Formula One driver. So that'll be very, very exciting.
I think what was really scary as well is directly after that lap, he comes out and goes, you know what, I actually left some time on the table there.
Yeah.
That lap could have been even better. And I'm thoroughly looking forward to seeing him take part as a 34-year-old in the 2041 Miami Grand Prix.
Don't. How crazy was that? How crazy
how old
was
are we
that?
going to be?
That's really, I'll be 41 years old. That's not, all right, let's swiftly move on, because that's a horrific thought in my head. Thank you very much, Sam. Let's move on to something which will make you even more unhappy, and that is, of course, our predictions from the Miami Grand Prix. And a big thank you to Mike, who was representing the fans. And we'll start off with Mike, because Mike had a pretty awesome weekend predictions-wise. Mike successfully predicted that Max Verstappen would claim pole position, so picked up 3 points. Mike also correctly predicted that Oscar Piastri would claim the win, and that George Russell would finish third. So Mike picked up for the fans a very impressive 9 points. Guess who also got 9 points, Sam?
It wasn't me, was it?
It was not you. It was me, because I successfully also predicted that Verstappen would claim pole, and I also successfully got that Lando would finish second. I said Max would win. He didn't. He came fourth, so I got no points for that. I said Oscar would come third. He didn't. He won, so I got no points for that as well. I also, though, got 3 points, and this is the first time this has happened this year in our predictors leaderboard, successfully predicted that Lando Norris would claim the fastest lap. So I have left Miami with an additional 9 points. Ian got 4. He got right that Piastri would win. He said Norris would finish second. He finished third. So we got a point for that. And Sam, you got 3.
Oh, this is getting ridiculous.
You said that Norris would win. He came second, so you got a point for that. You said Piastri would come second. He didn't. He won, so you got 1 point for that. And you said that Max would come third. He came fourth, so you also got a point for that. What's also fascinating is that you obviously switched as well, having trusted McLaren to get the fastest pit stop all season so far at each Grand Prix. You switched to Ferrari, who didn't have the fastest pit stop. It actually went to Stake Sauber, got the fastest pit stop. So well done, really? Stake. But what this all means is big changes in the Racing News 365 podcast predictors leaderboard. I am now sailing away in the lead on 42 points. Well done, Nick. Round of applause to myself. I'm going to pat myself on the back. Ian is in second on 34, so now an 8-point advantage I have. The fans have moved into third on 31, so Ian is only 3 ahead. He's got to watch out for the fans chasing him, all thousands of them. Sam, your last mate on, have a guess.
Oh, it's like 22, isn't it? It's like it's low.
You've done yourself a discredit there. It's 24. So I am, let me do some maths quickly, 6 points away from having double your score already after just 6 races. So, however, there are still 18 races to go. We're only a quarter of the way into the season. Still so much to be predicted. And we're also going to be introducing a new section to our predictors game for Imola, which we'll talk about at the end of this episode when we do our Imola predictions. But anyways, let's move on to the first real big talking point. And it's got to be the championship leader, who has won 4 of the 6 races this season. Oscar Piastri started in 4th, won the race. And it's fair to say the one weakness he had over the last couple of seasons was race pace. It wasn't very consistent, was always awesome over one lap, but could never really match Lando or Max when it came to race pace. He's definitely doing that now, and it's fair to say he's starting to look like he's got a bit of control over this championship.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because he didn't actually really bring his best stuff this weekend. No. In many ways, he wasn't quite at that really high standard that we've been seeing him operate, at in the last few rounds. And yet he came away having increased his championship advantage. Lando had a better weekend than he had recently. Oscar had a worse one. And Oscar's still kind of, managed to kind of eke out more of a gap, 10 points now 16. And that was including being really unlucky in the sprint to end up behind Lando. But I think that's a mark of how you put together a championship, is sometimes you have to win ugly. And it was difficult for him, but he prevailed. He took, he capitalized on opportunities and yet again showed how clinical he can be when fighting Max Verstappen wheel to wheel. And I think what was particularly interesting was watching how Oscar and Lando both navigated Max. Oscar was more deliberate. It feels like he was slightly cleaner with things, forced Max into a mistake, whereas Lando, first time didn't quite get it right, had to give the position back, then had to, kind of try again. And that cost Lando the opportunity to kind of close up on Oscar towards the end of the race. But going back to Oscar, his qualifying wasn't quite where it needed to be at points. He's improved that. So to the point now that when he qualifies 4th and Lando 2nd, it's almost a little bit of a surprise. And Lando is a very good qualifier. He's quick over one lap. Absolutely. And then, just the composure in the race. He's just, again, we talk about it every week, but that kind of really consistent, doesn't have, high highs or low lows. He's just constantly, working at it on a very, very level-headed kind of way. And he's putting together a really strong championship challenge. And as I said, if you can do that and maximize on weekends where you haven't been at your best, you're in pretty good stead.
And what's really fascinating about all of this is that it does feel like that. Yes, Lando is going to win more races this season. I think that's pretty obvious based on how dominant the McLaren was in Miami. But with Oscar, he just looks like he's got this consistency about him. We saw what Max did in 2023 when he had a dominant car. He, with the exception of obviously Singapore, was on the podium or winning literally every single Grand Prix. In my eyes, I see no reason why Oscar couldn't go the remainder of the season, finishing every single race in the top 4, in the top 5. It's going to take really now, you feel, a bad race for him and a good race for Lando to really see that momentum swing. Because even if, for example, Lando goes and wins in Imola, if Oscar's on the podium, it's not really going to be that much eaten into his lead. He's in a really interesting position where it just seems like, and you mentioned about, Oscar battling Max, nothing seems to phase Oscar, it feels like.
No, and that's particularly key when you're in a position like he is at the moment, when you have to weigh up how aggressive or how many risks you're going to take. Having that little buffer gives you that wiggle room to say, you know what, I don't have to completely, go for that. And, when you're right on the edge or having to push the edge when you're kind of, playing catch up, that's when those mistakes creep in and you end up having, messy qualifying laps or, going into an early retirement in a race because you've made a mistake. Oscar's in a position where he doesn't have to do that, which means it's going to be even more difficult for Lando to start recovering ground on Oscar. And yes, one retirement for Oscar and a Lando win would totally flip the standings as things are. But would it necessarily carry with it the momentum? It's very difficult to say that it would. You have to think that Oscar will come back and go, you know what, that was out of my control. I'm still here. I can still do what I need to do. Whether it changes the psychology, normally, I would say yes, it does, because you then have to adapt to the changed circumstance of them being behind. But we've seen how, as you say, consistent Oscar is. I really don't think it would change his outlook at all. And that is much to his credit.
And the thing that's really interesting as well is that when you move on, moving on to Lando, Oscar quite clearly has learned very in rapid fashion how to race Max, how to overtake Max, and more importantly, how to beat him. Lando, whilst he obviously finished ahead of Max, it feels like still hasn't learned that lesson, how to race Max, because what's really interesting is obviously we saw what happened in the first 2 corners, which cost Lando several places. He dropped back to 6th as a result of, trying to fight Max. He went ultra aggressive. What was really fascinating when he was in the media pen after the race and speaking to people, and obviously he was being asked the question, in hindsight, should you have played it safe and not tried to get Max at the first corner? Lando turned around and effectively said, well, if I don't go for it, people complain. If I do go for it, people complain. What am I supposed to do? I think the most important thing here, though, is that it almost felt like he went for that ultra aggressive approach. In my eyes, it was quite clear that Lando had a clear intention. He wanted to get past Max at the first corner to really give a statement that, he can do what Oscar can do, of course, what happened in Jeddah a couple of weeks ago. But in my eyes, it just seems like Lando still doesn't quite know how to beat Max at a first attempt in particular.
What was really interesting is once they got through the first corner and then they were kind of side by side. I mean, you can look back at that and you can kind of go, well, where was Lando really going to go? It was, it's difficult there. You're on the outside. Max has that corner. He has that line, and Max is Max. He's going to push you to the outside, and I will, say he was within his right to do that. It shouldn't have been a penalty. And I think had he been more defensive, he could have then built into the race and, things wouldn't have unfolded as they did. Or if he hadn't messed up his, the final real corner in that qualifying lap and he'd taken pole, would things have turned out the way they did? Potentially not. It's very difficult to rerun the race with different circumstances, but you take my point. So I think for Lando, he's absolutely right that he can't win. He's damned if he does, damned if he doesn't. And people are always going to criticize him. And that's a real shame. But when you analyze how he, as I kind of alluded to earlier, he interacts with Max in wheel-to-wheel racing versus how Oscar does, it feels like Lando is trying to bring this kind of match Max's Max, basically, and bludgeon his way and say, you know what, I'm gonna fight fire with fire. And in some ways, maybe that that's what's not working for him. Because yes, in Saudi Arabia, you could look at that Oscar incident in the first corner and say Oscar bludgeoned his way through. But in many ways, he kind of outfoxed him, as he did in Miami to get past. He forced Max into a mistake. he didn't just kind of, barge his way past, directly. As Andrea Stella said himself, that move that Oscar made into the first corner in Jeddah was all about the launch. It was all about positioning. Actually, how he pushed Max to the outside was just the end product of that move once he'd done everything he needed to do. And so it's almost like Lando's fighting fire with fire when it comes to Max, and Oscar's fighting, is using water to fight with fire. And it's just so much more effective because, it seems to be a little more calculated, a little bit more guile in how Oscar's doing things compared to Lando.
Moving on to Max, and something really interesting is that you look at this season, it's quite clear that Red Bull don't have the strongest car, whether it's second or third in the pecking order, that's up for debate. But the important point about where we're trying to get to is Red Bull do not have the strongest car this season. Of course, we know that it didn't have the strongest car for the second half of last season, but it was so dominant at the start of the year in 2024 that Max was imperious, built a lead to the size which he could control, even in a weak package. It feels like, having seen Miami, that does Max need to tweak his approach a little bit to try and claim this 5th consecutive title? Because you look at all of his titles, 2021, the Red Bull was the only car able to compete with the Mercedes and at times was stronger. You look at 2022, 2023, the Red Bull was superior. The first half of 2024, as I just said, Red Bull had the edge over everybody else, fell behind a little bit in the second half of the year. This year, quite clearly, they are on the back foot. They're not able to, at least when it comes to race pace, match the McLaren. Helmut Marko revealed after the race that McLaren were 0.7 to a second faster than Red Bull per lap, which is a remarkable margin that McLaren had over Red Bull and a big thing for Red Bull to try and fix. Max, we saw, and rightly so, of course, went so aggressive. He wanted to do everything in his power to ensure that Lando didn't get ahead, that Oscar didn't get ahead. Of course, they both did in the end. Same with George Russell, of course, but that was under the VSC. Max didn't want to lose the position, but in the end, hurt his own race to a certain extent because of the time that he lost. Does Max need to come to the rest of the season, at least for the next few rounds, with a slightly different approach to try and topple McLaren and, most importantly, put himself in a position where the 5th consecutive title can happen?
Yes, because this weekend in that Grand Prix was the first time in a long time. Maybe Saudi Arabia, things he could have done differently, or the Red Bull could have done differently. But the thing that the kind of the foundation in which he built his championship last year on, as we kind of said with great enthusiasm, was his ability to just maximize what was on offer every single weekend, and he didn't do that in Miami. And when you've got Christian Horner acknowledging that himself, that's probably, because Christian will back Max to the hilt. The whole Red Bull family will. But for Christian to say, look, he probably did hurt himself, hurt his race by defending so hard, whilst acknowledging correctly how admirable his defense was. Because let's face it, you're fighting for the lead of a race. What else are you going to do? It's very difficult to go, okay, you go. I'll take third. Because you look at that and go, well, I'm losing points and I might not necessarily have to. But had he not fought both Oscar and Lando as hard as he did, he would have finished third. He would have got, George would have come out of the VSC pit stop behind Max, and Max probably would have been able to hold on. And then, what we saw at the end with Red Bull kind of protesting the result, realistically, it was kind of clutching at straws, if we're being fair, to try and kind of, reverse the way Max had raced. And Lando himself said he wasn't racing smart. And he's absolutely right. Lando's annoyed, obviously, because he's been cost the opportunity to go for victory in a number of ways by fighting Max. But he is also correct in saying that Max didn't get the best result that was on offer for him because of his on-track, wheel-to-wheel defense, as strong as it was. I think it would be prudent for him to do that, because when you can't win or finish second, you need to try and finish third. And that's what he needs to do, and then hope that down the season, McLaren have some reliability, the two of them clash, and then he can start picking up points that way. Because, he just needs to stay in the fight as best he can.
What we have seen, though, from Red Bull, but also Mercedes, and obviously looking at the likes of, Max, Kimi and George, definitely not Yuki Tsunoda at the moment, is that over one lap in qualifying, McLaren are beatable. Their real advantage isn't actually over one lap pace. It is in race pace, where at the moment they just can't be touched effectively. As I just mentioned, Marco revealed that Red Bull were 0.7 to 1 second a lap slower in the race. But in qualifying, Max had the edge. Max claimed pole. Of course, it was Kimi Antonelli on sprint pole. And we've seen this already this season with Max having claimed obviously a couple of poles this season already. 3 poles now for him, of course, is that Max can fight the McLarens for pole positions. And when we go to circuits coming up, for example, Imola, we know how difficult overtaking is there. Look at what happened between Max and Lando last year. If Max claims pole, then, well, you've got to favour him for a victory, even if his race pace isn't as good as a McLaren's. We then go to Monaco, and guess what? Who normally wins the race from Monaco? The guy who starts on pole. There's got to be at least then some hope for Red Bull that with McLaren being beatable over one lap, that Max can still claim several wins this season.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I mean, kind of when I say that he needs to wait for those opportunities as and when they present themselves. Because, it makes sense that McLaren's advantage is enhanced in the race. As it was pointed out by Christian himself post-race, that's when, all the car, the tyres, everything, and the whole tyre thing is a whole other debate in itself. But all the components in an F1 car run hot, much hotter during a race, because obviously it's 57 laps as opposed to a handful that you're running in qualifying across with nice breaks in between. So that's where McLaren's advantage is more pronounced, because they are able to cool the tyres and the brakes and so on and so forth better, making their race pace therefore more effective. So you are absolutely spot on when you say that places like Emilia Romagna, or Imola as us oldies would refer to it as, that's where he's got to capitalise. They're going to be his opportunities. Unfortunately, places like Monaco, probably not. As we saw last year, the RB20 really did not like the streets of Monte Carlo. And so it will be a delicate balance that Max has to strike. And I think it's all kind of in conjunction with one another, how he needs to approach these things. And part of that is, as I said before, just slightly softening that aggressive edge that he has. I think that will probably serve him well.
Moving on to Mercedes, and I've got a question for you, because we've seen that George Russell was competitive, of course, has claimed a few podiums this season. Kimi Antonelli also is growing into his F1 career. He's getting more confident, as we've obviously already discussed, claimed a brilliant sprint pole in Miami. But what are Mercedes fighting for this season, do you think? Because McLaren are rapidly escaping with this constructors title. I think they've already got over a 100-point advantage over Mercedes, if I'm correct. I'll check it actually whilst you're talking in a second. But if that is already the size, McLaren are likely just going to keep extending this lead at the moment, unless they tangle with each other and something goes wrong, which at the moment doesn't look very likely. For a team like Mercedes, who don't necessarily have the drivers like a Max, who can still wrestle for race wins, can still wrestle to fight for this title, why don't Mercedes focus on next season?
Well, we don't know truly what's going on behind the scenes.
It's a very good point.
So there may well be, vast resources, heavily weighted towards 2026 already. I think they feel that they have the opportunity to still have a very good year. Finishing second in the Constructors' Championship would still be a good year by kind of recent standards have been for the team. But realistically, this year is a prep year. Yes, you need to funnel your resources into 2026 in terms of the chassis, also the power unit. All that we're hearing so far is very confident things coming out of Mercedes, which unfortunately for them also bodes very well for McLaren. It's going to be an interesting kind of delicate balance they've got to strike, because if McLaren continue in this kind of vein of form, it's difficult to argue that the gap will be any less under new regulations in 12 months' time. But for me, so much of it comes down to the two drivers. Assuming Max doesn't make the jump, and all the stuff that's surrounding him and Mercedes and Aston Martin and so on and so forth, assuming that it is George Russell and Kimi Antonelli in that Mercedes W17, we're going to call it, next year, you want this year to get George Russell as ready as he possibly can be for a full-on championship assault. And you want to get Kimi Antonelli as up to speed as possible, as across the year, get him in the position where he's fighting for, the maximum points on offer any given weekend, where he's closed the gap to George. And we saw that for the first time over one lap in Miami. Kimi actually have the upper hand, as we've already discussed.
Yeah.
Whereas before it was kind of 2 to 4 tenths a lap between them. And you go, yeah, that's quite a lot. But also George is performing brilliantly this year. So, that's no slight on Kimi in any way, shape or form. But yeah, this year is about getting George ready to be a champion next year if they can deliver the car. And also Kimi at worst, to be a very, very solid second, and potentially in a position, depending on how he develops, to fight for a championship. And, that sounds like a really lofty claim, but it's not the first time that would have happened. Lewis Hamilton, Jacques Villeneuve, drivers can and do win in titles in their second season in F1. Yes, they're two historic references, and yes, they weren't 18 years of age when they made their debuts. But I think it'd be foolish to kind of completely rule them out so long from the start of next season.
And I was correct. McLaren are 105 points ahead of Mercedes already. One team who are even further adrift at 152 points behind after just 6 races. Ferrari. I mean, surely we talk about teams switching focus to next season. If there's one team who must be thinking now, what are we doing with this car? It's got to be Ferrari, because neither Lewis or Charles are going to win the title this season unless the most remarkable turnaround happens. That doesn't look likely at the moment. Far from it, especially when you look at the fact that Alex Albon finished 5th ahead of both Charles and Lewis in 7th and 8th. If there's any team, Sam, when we look at the front runners who should be looking for next season now and almost sacrificing this season, surely it's now got to be Ferrari, because it's just getting worse. Yeah,
absolutely. Because, there it was.
Hey, we got the absolutely. There we go. Carry on.
I feel somewhat vindicated by the fact that I'm the one who caused it. But anyway, even if Ferrari do make some remarkable turnaround and find themselves fighting for championship this year, I mean, let's not forget, all of that goes in the bin at the end of the year. So is that actually a worthwhile use of resources? It's difficult to say, because you only find out once you've already funneled all of those resources into that, and you might do that and it not turn your season around, in which case you've just unnecessarily put yourself on the back foot. So it'd be difficult to say that they would not start looking at 2026 earlier than some of the other teams around them. But that said, what teams are around them? It's kind of changing, and you look at this weekend, and it was Williams who was around them. And what's really kind of damning for Ferrari is that all indications point to Williams having already been the kind of first mover in turning their attention to 2026.
Yeah.
So if you've got Williams kind of nipping at your heels and surpassing you whilst not really focusing on the year, that's not sending a particularly good message. So yeah, concerning for Ferrari, definitely. It would just, I think what was, really the biggest kind of indictment on their form was the fact that even the drivers are kind of going, we're fighting Williams. Like, we're the fourth quickest team, but we can't compete with the 3 ahead. They're our peers, but they're in a different league at the moment. And actually, Williams, who, let's face it, were a minnow for years. And obviously, that's not diminished too much their achievements. They have won 9 constructors titles, but they have not been the team they once were for a long time. And so to then have Ferrari fighting Williams, as I said, it's not
old school.
But also, once we're on old school, adding the HP logo in such a way that they did over the weekend really made it feel like it was a kind of a merged Schumacher car between Michael's Ferrari and Ralph's HP Williams.
That's a very good point.
From the early 2000s, yeah. I mean, as ugly as it was quite a nice ode to those two drivers. But also, we can't not address the team radio.
Oh, wow.
That happened. But this is the thing. You just look at it and you go, okay, but even if they can produce the car that can compete, operationally, are they able to compete? Because when you're making those kind of mistakes and you can't, to use kind of office jargon, get your ducks in a row when you're fighting for 7th and 8th, what makes you think you're going to be able to do that when you're fighting for podiums and wins? It's very difficult. And we kind of thought that this had kind of gone with Fred Vasseur and the leadership, and kind of his era had been. It felt more stable. It felt more controlled from that kind of operational side of things on the pit wall. But it was a mess. Not only did they hesitate, and there was indecision, and they didn't really know whether or not they should make the call, and then they did it too late. They then didn't adequately communicate to the drivers. I mean, you tell Charles, "Oh yeah, we're switching positions," and then a few minutes later, okay, so it turns out we forgot to tell Lewis, so we're going to try that again. I mean, come on, like that's I know it sounds harsh, but it wasn't up to standard.
The thing I wonder as well is obviously Lewis came out in the media pen afterwards and said that his comments were just sarcastic. There was nothing, there was no aggression behind them, and that may well be the case, but I wonder in the back of my head, is that Lewis saying this to protect the team a little bit, so it's not sounding like he is having a massive go at them? I guess only Lewis knows that that answer. I think that's something interesting. That's at least in the back of my mind. The final team I want to discuss before we do our Imola predictions in a moment, it is Williams. We've obviously touched on them a little bit in the last few minutes, but it's remarkable what they are achieving. Alex Albon, 2 P5 finishes already this season, just 6 races into the year. And what's fascinating is, as we've spoken about 2026 quite a bit in this episode, one team we know who are putting all of their eggs in the 2026 basket is Williams. There's very little that's actually been done to their 2025 car. And yet here they are, comfortably, it seems, the lead midfield team, to a point where at the moment, they can compete with Ferrari. They can touch on the door with Mercedes at times. Of course, Alex was ahead of Kimi Antonelli. Carlos Sainz, of course, finished behind Lewis in 9th, but he was fighting with both Ferraris during the race in Miami. This has got to be, at the moment, when you really look at everything going on this season, perhaps the biggest story of the year. Quite this sudden rise from Williams, who actually had a pretty dire, it's fair to say, 2024.
It's been almost metronomic.
Yeah.
It's like meteoric. Sorry, metronomic. Meteoric. God, it's been a long weekend.
It's been a very long weekend.
For context, I was working by Nick has been working ridiculous hours, so I can't really complain. He's covering Formula E and then F1 and working late shifts. I was working the early shifts, but that means that I was working by myself. So kind of clearly not yet well adjusted to speaking to people yet. But no, on a more serious note, I think what's fascinating is so often teams will be like, but it's all about the kind of long-term vision. It's all about, kind of a few years down the line. And then you slowly get there and those results just don't, kind of come to fruition. We see with Alpine, and they often talk about these 5-year plans, and then 5 years down the line, they've got another 5-year plan.
Yeah. And
you kind of worry that Williams were going to kind of get sucked into that kind of situation where they're fully focused on something that's so far down the road, and it gets there and they haven't actually, that doesn't materialize. But it's happened earlier than we expected. They suffered a lot last year, as you mentioned, by changing direction, changing tack with the car, and it looked just like a really painful year. And you thought, oh God, are they going to be able to do this? Like, structurally, does the team have what it needs to recover to where it used to be, decades ago? And the evidence this year suggests that absolutely they can do. And, next year they're going into a new regulations era where they've really been focusing for a long time. And as you said, probably the first team to really focus on this year. They've got a Mercedes power unit, as we've already discussed, good things are, kind of, there's good noises coming out of Mercedes on that front. So they're looking really, really strong. Alex Albon has already scored 3 points more than he did across the entire 2023 season when he had a really good year with 6 rounds in. And he's also, yes, Carlos needs to kind of get his feet under the desk at Williams, but I think Carlos has 7 points? Alex has 30? He's really taking the fight and saying, you know what? Everyone was going to be like, Carlos, race winner, blah, blah, blah. And he goes, no, I am good enough for this, to go against these drivers. And he's had an absolutely brilliant season, and 2 fifth place finishes completely shows that.
Shall we end on our Imola predictions? Because I think this is going to be a difficult one. We've obviously got to announce as well that to spice things up a little bit, of course, at the moment we predict who we think is going to claim pole position, who we think is going to claim the fastest lap, which team we think will produce the fastest pit stop, and which drivers will finish the race in the top three. Starting from Imola, we're going to introduce another question we have to answer. Who do we think is going to finish the race in 10th? Yes, for every single race now going forward, we're going to guess who we thinks in P10, which is kind of why I guess as random as trying to correctly predict who's going to get the fastest lap.
But I can't remember if I said it on air on the podcast or if I said it afterwards, and I'm hoping you'll remember. But I made a joke about how I'm basically going to choose Yuki Tsunoda for the 10th place finish every week.
And that's how you're going to get your points probably.
And who finished 10th in Miami?
Yes, okay. On this note then, and of course, to those who are watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know in the comments below your predictions, playing along with our predictor game for the Imola Grand Prix. Nearly said Miami, we're not doing another Miami Grand Prix till next year, or at least till 2041. Sam, you can go first. What are your predictions for Imola?
Okay, so 10th place finish, Yuki Tsunoda. I've said it.
Go for it. Go on.
I'm a man of my words. I still think George will win the World Championship this year. Right, okay. Pole, Oscar.
Interesting.
Fastest lap, Isaac Hadjar. Fastest pit stop, Ferrari. Top three, Oscar first, Max second, Lando third.
Okay, so just so our viewers know, Ian is going to give his predictions in next week's episode with our special guest. So now it's just down to my predictions. And it's a weird one because in the back of my mind, I'm kind of thinking of what's happened last year and over recent seasons at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix. I'm going to go for Lando Norris on pole position. I'm going to say Norris to also set the fastest lap. McLaren fastest pit stop. P10, Isaac Hadjar. But my top three, I'm going to go Verstappen to win, Piastri second, and Norris in third. Because I've got a feeling, this is even going well beyond my predictions, I can see Max qualifying on the front row, and I can see Max and Lando have a little coming together at the first corner with neither of them wanting to yield. If that really does happen, then we may as well cancel this predictor leaderboard now because I'm going to walk away with the crown.
That's
just putting out there now.
It does lend to it, to be fair. And I like your Isaac pick. That's a nice pick for 10th. But also, I think we should not let Ian watch this podcast. I don't think he should be able to.
I'm not telling him. I'm not telling him. And I'm going to ban him.
It's got to be organic, what he says.
I'm going to ask the person at Racing News 365 who has control to the YouTube channel just to block him. He can't see it. And then when he's made his predictions, we can then unblock him, but it's fine. So Ian, if you're watching this, well, you've made your predictions by now because anyway, this has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast. Sam, amazing stuff as always. To those who are watching on YouTube, let us know your thoughts below on anything we've discussed in the comment section below. And also if you are watching this on YouTube, please do smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you with next week's special podcast. See you later.
Take care, folks, and thanks for joining us. Peace out.